was the nicest introduction I think I've ever had. I'm very happy to be here, sharing with you some of my thoughts, some of the past work that I've done in studying cognitive aging. Dr. Berry is continuing to become an old and dear friend, which always scares me because those are the people that no matter what they ask you to do, you do it for them. But I wanted to get a chance to kind of talk to you all a little bit about, I guess this is almost a retrospect. I'm taking a second and pausing and kind of thinking about where some of my research has gone and what I've done and what is it really contributing. And so we came up with this title, Risk and Resilience. And I noticed I'm going to try to insert as much resilience in there as possible, but far too often we do talk about risk. We talk about the problems and how things go bad as we grow older. And lots of people are not interested in older people because they think that that's what happens when you get old. Everything just goes to pot. Not really. And the group that's coming along, if you keep hearing about the baby boomers, I'm telling you, your commercials are going to change, your products that you're going to see that are advertised are changed. Look at Betty White. Her career has been, resurrected. And so to some degree, we're really even changing the way we think about aging. I study in terms of cognitive functioning, a group that's really been understood as African Americans. And as I have been looking at it, I usually find, when I started off anyway, I found this pattern, whereas I looked at research that had data on whites and data on blacks. Does anybody notice anything different about those two plots of data?
The Caucasians, it's more regular.
Ooh, you use regular. Let's say they're less varied.
Yeah.
And, the African Americans, boy, it's all around like this. And actually, if you do, there's a little test that you can do. And the variability, when you're doing your research program, which I'm very impressed to see and hear how much research actually at the undergraduate level you all are doing. That's how I got started. But I got started actually studying mice. But the activity of doing research was what got me into graduate school, was what pushed me on. It was really the starting point. So you guys are at a very important starting point. I encourage you to work with your mentors as much as you can and learn as much as you can. But this little test of heterogeneity shows that there's actually a difference, a statistical difference between these two groups. And so in terms of trying to explain it, there's not a lot of theories of cognitive aging. Not really. People think that there's not a lot of theories of cognitive aging. There are kind of hypotheses and guesses. And one of them is the cognitive reserve hypothesis, which suggests that as cognitive functioning goes down over the years, we think that it's going down. We do have things like risk that for different factors that actually hurt us if they're going poorly, like if our lung function, how much we breathe. Our oxygen basically feeds our brain, and if our lungs aren't working as efficiently as they used to when we were 20, that it's going to impact cognitive function. But there are also things that we do, like education, like getting your degree here, that actually help to support and to keep that cognitive functioning from declining at a faster rate than it might if you didn't have as much education as you do. I'm actually not going to talk about it today because I couldn't fit it all in, but social support's another factor. But I'm going to talk about a couple of these other factors. And as you saw from that last slide, actually most of the little examples I have are all around health. In terms of trying to compare Caucasians to African Americans, I thought that that variability difference that I saw, I said, I bet you a lot of that is differences in health. Because as you look at differences in health between blacks and whites, what you see is that African Americans have a lower life expectancy rate. They have higher rates of chronic diseases, all of those that are listed there. And if we look even further and take a look at the effects of blood pressure, for example, on coronary heart disease mortality, that what you see is that for African Americans, they're some of the highest. The same thing is true in terms of blood pressure. This is for African American men, and the red line's men and the yellow line is women. And you see that once you get into the 60s and 70s, there's really a huge difference in how much hypertension that you actually observe in people of that age. One more slide to bring home the issue, and that is to look at this is how much end-stage renal disease by diastolic blood pressure. So that diastolic pressure is not the only thing that impacts kidney function, but end-stage renal disease is when your kidneys stop working. It's related to obesity and other disease issues. But what you find is that the incidence really goes up as you get older. Not by older, this is even by pressure. And so blood pressure is one central factor that actually impacts lots of other things, not only hypertension, but coronary heart disease, cardiovascular disease. It's one of the insidious ones. I don't have a lot of data on it. Actually, I don't have any today. But obesity is something that is coming down the road. That it has implications for cognitive functioning, believe it or not, because of things like metabolic syndrome, where all of our levels of our lipids and different factors that we measure in terms of good health are actually thrown off because we're overweight. And we're overweight partly because we're sedentary, because the kind of food we're eating. All of those things are going to complicate health as you grow older, as our population grows older. There's some very specific implications that chronic conditions have on cognitive functioning, particularly for cardiovascular disease and diabetes and hypertension. There's damage to blood vessels. There's increased risk for vascular dementia. This is a point. I just came back from Jackson, Mississippi. I had to think about it where I've been for a second. That's because I'm talking about dementia. But the Alzheimer's Association has come out and said, you know something, there really is, there's a 2- to 4-fold, it depends on how you look at it, greater risk in African Americans of getting dementia. And Alzheimer's Association is great. They have reviewed things from lots of experts, but I think one of the issues is that it's likely that a lot of what they're calling dementia is not Alzheimer's disease, it's actually vascular dementia. Because for the reasons that I just showed you, that in terms of cardiovascular problems, blacks are 2 or 3 times more likely to have problems, particularly after the age of 65. And so, you know, if you take all of this together, I thought what I'd share with you today is to try to answer a couple of questions from some of the work that I've done. One question is does health account for differences in cognition between African Americans and Caucasians? And 2, does health impact individual differences in cognition in African Americans? I put up this slide to say, don't do what I do. My mentor told me, even as an undergraduate, oh, Keith, you've got to focus. We need to really focus you, and you need to focus in an area. And I'd say, yeah, and he'd have me read stuff, and I'd read it, and then I'd say, what about this? What about this? And what about this? Everything became interesting to me. I'm one of the few survivors. You really should do that. But what I thought is that I'm really interested in why does one person end up getting hypertension and another person doesn't? Why does one person, their mind works really fast and another person's mind doesn't work as fast? What are those causes that make us different from one another? And to answer that, I couldn't just be too focused. I actually needed to study both individuals and how they vary, but also using a method of twins. And I'm not going to share with you the twin method, I'm going to share with you my twin study. But with twins, because we know the genetic architecture, we can talk about why people are different from one another comes from genetic sources or from environmental sources. And that's the utility of that particular approach. I also always like to say I have used primary data and secondary data. Primary data is my data, secondary data is data that I borrow from somebody. And I've been very, very lucky to have some great colleagues who have loaned me data that's been critical in trying to answer the kinds of questions that I do. Before we leave this slide, I always like to highlight that, yes, primary data and the adult Russian twin study that I went over to Moscow. Actually, I'll just use it since she's in the room anyway. Right before I got married, I actually did the study. I mean, right before I got married. I got married in June. I went over to the study in late April. And the internet and all of that, this is 94, I don't know. Communication wasn't really great. And so what it looked like is that I had run out on my bride. And I went all the way to Moscow. And so her famous words were, you know, if you want to get out of this, you don't have to go to Russia to do it. You know? But maybe another time we can talk about that because that's an interesting stuff.
Consider yourself invited.
So let's use this paper as an example of racial differences. Actually, a lot of my work actually focuses only on African Americans because I feel like there's probably enough comparative stuff. I actually want to know what's going on within the group so I can make better, effective comparisons. But this is an example of some of the work that I've done that actually is a comparison. I always want to acknowledge this is from secondary data. This is from data from a study called the MacArthur Study of Successful Aging. And those folks are like huge in the aging field, and I was just a lonely little assistant professor and kind of came begging to ask to use their data, and they said, "Oh, sure." I said, "Oh, now I have to do it." Okay. So what I did was to have the objective of examining the influence of race on a task called the Boston Naming Task. It's a task where you just name these line drawings. And believe it or not, as people grow older, they can't figure out exactly what it is. The error rate, how many errors they make in the kinds of cards that you flash them actually increases. And particularly if they have dementia, they can't figure out what it is. I'm sorry. So I said, well, let's take a look at that task, because that's the task that was in the study, and see if there's individual variability relative to health, social, psychological, and mental health variables, and to see if that actually accounts for why you find differences between blacks and whites. And sure enough, once I accounted for all of those things, rather than just say, let's compare blacks to whites, I said, but let's compare what all those other things that make folks different too. Once I did that, what you found was that there was not a significant race effect anymore, that the groups actually started to become more alike. And so I think in particular, it was the health variables that really came out as you looked at interactions between race and health, because there are race differences in health. So you want to look at race interactions. When you accounted for those, it made the race differences go away. So what I think is for our first question anyway, I think we can say, at least from that evidence, that yes, we can account for differences in cognition between race if we understand health. The next question is does health impact individual differences in cognition in African Americans? Like I said, I'm not going to show you the twin method per se, but I'm going to talk about my twin study. And we have twins actually in their 20s, 30s, 40s. Actually, this is a group, this is a pair that were in their 80s, actually almost their 90s. They made it to 91. And I always like to tell the story of them. They actually have never lived more than 5 miles apart. One of the pair got married. And I don't know if the other one was pissed about it or not, but she just moved like 5 miles down the road. And then when the one who got married's husband died, she moved back in with her. So lots of interesting stories. None of this work ever gets done by me, even though I get to stand up and talk about it. We always have a team, and it's amazing how big that team is. And I'll tell you how monumental a task it was to try to find twins. But our study ended up involving 285 pairs of twins, ranging in age from 25 to 92 years of age. They all were ascertained from birth records in North Carolina. We're in Virginia. Let's see. You can't get birth records here. Actually, the Medical College of Virginia has done a twin study as well. But North Carolina is one of the few states that I can actually physically go into where they keep all of the birth records, and I can record them. Now, lots of folks do them because they have family reunions and they want to know everybody who might have been in the family. And each year that they have family reunions, it seems like they learn somebody else. They go back and they try to get their birth information and try to put it all together. But we got them to be able to try to find twins. And once we found those twins, we actually looked at things like health and memory and physical functioning and mental health and social factors, and wanted to see how alike were they. Were the identical twins more alike than the fraternal twins? Genetically, we know that they're 100% alike, and that the fraternal twins are like a brother and a sister. They're about half as alike genetically. So we could break out genetic and environmental influences that way. The final sample ended up including about 706 interviews, because African Americans and health disparities, what would happen is we'd find a set of twins, and I'd say, oh, I'd find one twin. I'd say, oh, you have a brother, don't you? You're a twin, aren't you? Yes, I'm a twin. You have a brother, don't you? Yes, and he just died 2 weeks ago. Those were always, how do you even talk to somebody like that? Because they're still grieving. But we would give them a little time, then we come back and ask them to actually participate in our study. And so we have these folks that I call singletons. They're really surviving members of non-intact twin pairs. And when we had people who had lost a twin, we tried to go and actually get some of their siblings to participate in about 30 pairs. That actually was true. I had it, while I was talking, it came up and showed here, but that we traveled over 100,000 miles to find the twins that we had in our study. Those twins are distributed all over North Carolina, not in one particular place, but they're not only limited to North Carolina, actually to Connecticut, Wisconsin, Virginia, Georgia, Michigan, Colorado. I think they're all the states. The study's been over for 7 years. I still have to thank my staff because they would really, wherever it was, wherever the person was, they would go to them and interview them. Now, once we found them, we actually then tortured them for about 3.5 hours and collected a lot of data, over 800 variables in this data set. It allows me to continue to publish on it today because there's still stuff we have not done. But what I want to do is to focus on just a couple of the things, particularly focusing on the cognition, and then in terms of pulmonary functioning for the health that we ascertain, and looking at, in terms of health status, and looking at blood pressure. So, remember, we're trying to figure out why people are different from one another. And one of the things that I think is a major cause is blood pressure. And so what we did was, let's see, in this one, we use the twin study in lots of ways. We actually use it to compare twins. And sometimes we just take one twin and say, hey, if there's still like 350, it's plenty of people to be able to actually do an analysis, more than most studies actually have. And with some new statistical procedures, hierarchical modeling, we can actually say, well, let's put in both of those twins, and we know that they're related and like one another, so let's just statistically control for that. We can still then put 2 in, and we can have more. Now, we did that actually for this particular study, but we limited them to anybody who was only over 50, and as you know, that was only about half the age range. They go down to about 25. So they were 49 years of age and older. There's the other statistics on them. I'm always actually even impressed with this number, which is that we have 40% males. Men, particularly in studies of aging, they're 25% or less. Actually, in one of my other studies, they're 25% less. We use these various measures, and rather than talking about each one of them, I try to put what they are, because I'm very quick to say the tics, and I think I'll say that a little bit later on in a minute here, but that it measures cognitive impairment, working memory, and our logical memory had both a short-term memory and a long-term memory component, as well as being able to look at speed. As we looked at the correlations, things look good. Wow. You know, there is a lot of relationship between at least systolic blood pressure and all of our measures, with the exception of that one. And hey, diastolic pressure, pick that one. But as we statistically went in and said, well, but there's other stuff going on too. There's age, there's differences in age even within that restricted age range, and gender and education and income. Once we did that, we still had some hits. We still had systolic blood pressure being significant for digit symbol, which is the speed measure, immediate recall, which is a memory measure, and the tics, which is a cognitive impairment measure. So the summary of the results, it's systolic but not diastolic, and seem to be actually creating variability and accounting for declines in cognitive functioning. Speed and memory seem to be the most affected, but working memory and executive memory type functionings were not affected. So that was blood pressure. I said, okay, so that's a nice, interesting piece of health. But what about lung function? Let's take a look at it. So we used the same data set, and in this time we just used one twin from each pair. You see the number changes ever so slightly. And because for lung function there's supposed to be a big change right around 50. And I wanted to see if we could kind of capture that change and contrast the differences that you might find. So we created a younger group and an older group. And we measured what's called average peak expiratory flow. Anybody here got asthma? Yeah, somebody has to have asthma. If you don't, you probably just don't know. When you go to the doctor and you're having an asthma attack, what do? They have you blow into that little tube. Okay, it's called a mini right peak flow meter. That's at least the convenient, off-the-shelf one. At the doctors, hopefully they're using the real fancy spirometer measure. but it's actually just this little thing, looks like a tube from a paper towel roll, and it has a little gauge on the side of it, and it's how much air you can actually expire. And it's a very good and very, very simple measure, very, very powerful measure as well. So we used that to measure lung function, and then we came back to our same little cognitive measures that we had in the last study. And after controlling for education, age, and hack years, because we had, of course, North Carolina, plenty of people who smoke, and that does affect lung function. We didn't see anything happen for the younger group, but for the older group, sure enough, particularly for the tics, which is the general kind of cognitive impairment measure. So it relies a lot on memory as well. That one was actually affected. So what we hypothesize is that what we're seeing is the same change that we're seeing in terms of health in this population. COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, is actually on the rise in this population. And whether it's from cohorts of smoking or what, it's coming up as one of the top 5 killers of African Americans. And so it kind of makes sense. It makes sense that it only happens and takes its effect cumulatively, so it's when you start to get older that you really see that effect. So let me take you on a trip right up the road. This is about the halfway point. That's funny. Richmond's about the halfway point between Duke and the work that I do in Baltimore. And the work I do in Baltimore is actually located right here in this beautiful building. This building actually was the private residence of 2 sisters, if you can believe it. One lived in this tower, and the other one lived in this tower. This building is connected. It's huge. They had a huge art collection that spanned, I think it was one floor for each side. It now houses over 286 older folks. And so from 2 people to 86. Good, efficient use of space, but it's been a wonderful place. And the reason why we do that is because we're able to actually be where older people are. And to some degree, I started this study actually in 1997 when I was still at Penn State. And being an outsider kind of coming there, I needed a home place. And so that's what I did, was to actually establish an office in that particular building. The Baltimore Study of Black Aging is actually not a study. It's actually several studies. Here's my lack of focus again. I would kind of get out there and I recruit, like we recruited 249 people, which at that time we were just overwhelmed because we were doing studies of like 50 older African Americans. But the population is large there. We had a lot of success. We did things right. But I started coming up with other questions. And so rather than just do the same thing over again, I would do something different. And so over the years, we have had several studies. And I'm going to end up today talking about the one that we're currently involved with. But the first one that we started with gives us an opportunity to look at what's called everyday problem solving. Now, those other tasks, some of you who work in, like, for example, with Dr. Berry may be familiar with some of them. They're called psychometric kinds of tests. It's, you know, you show somebody some figure somebody drew, or a letter that's turned upside down, and you have people do different kinds of things. An everyday problems task is saying, people don't understand when it's not grounded in something that's real. Let's get them to, and ask them to do something that's real. So actually for this particular task, what we would do is to say, so you have to balance your checkbook. So if you have $150 and then you subtract 50 from it, what do you get? And we'd have them do practical kinds of tasks to measure their cognitive functioning, rather than these kind of different, you know, obtuse kinds of measures. And we did that and looked at it in relationship to health in this particular study. And what we did was to take a look at chronic conditions and to really look at the effect of not just one chronic condition, but what if you have multiple chronic conditions. And I think we had a total of 6, and we had people who had 6. Arthritis, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, stroke. There's one more. Diabetes. Okay? And we also had them self-rate health, where they would actually say, we would actually say, how good is your health? And they tell us, and believe it or not, that's a really good measure for a lot of things. That, and why the question always arises, I mean, why is it better than a doctor diagnosing, or is it as good as maybe a doctor diagnosing someone's health condition? And it's because they may actually have some knowledge about preclinical conditions, about how they felt over time, and not what's just being measured at one point in time. So an important health measure, and there's different ways to measure it too. You could say, how do you feel now? How's your health now? How was your health 5 years ago? And how's your health compared to other people that you know your age? How good is your health? And we asked all of those questions. When we compared it to everyday problem solving, there was a significant number. The systemic diseases were related to increases. Let's see, increases in systemic diseases meant cognitive performance goes down. And interestingly enough, when people reported that their health had improved, their everyday problem solving went down. And this was one of those ones, this was a hard-fought article to try to figure out what in the world was going on. But as we started looking at the data, what it was is that people whose health was kind of poor to begin with looked like it might have been worse before. So when they say it improved, you know, well, basically I was on death's bed, but now I can walk. So it was that it had improved, but it looked like it had improved from a much worse state because those folks were still not doing as well as some other folks. Interesting just to see that you've really got to try to pull things out to be able to understand what's going on. There's another round here in this effort to try to look at the impact of health on cognitive functioning. And as Dr. Berry mentioned, I have a whole nother set of, or a whole nother study that cognition desegregation, thinking that there were some qualitative differences between blacks and whites and what went on for cognition, and that you really needed to study them within a group and even compare people who had gone to desegregated schools versus who had gone to regular schools. That's another topic. But it brought me to think about how important education is, and even kind of ask myself, which is more important? Is it education or is it health? Education is this long-standing variable that's been shown to influence cognitive function. It kind of makes sense. You know, you exercise your brain with education, it gets bigger and starts coming out your ears or whatever. I mean, but it's, you know, your cognitive function. That just makes practical sense. But as we've shown, health also seems to have an influence on cognitive functioning. And overlapping the literature that shows that there are health disparities, and particularly that suggests that health disparities in education are related to one another, that you find differences across groups, but those differences get even bigger when you compare the poorest of those groups. So if you look at poor whites and poor blacks, there's even bigger differences and smaller differences between high-income, high-educated blacks and whites. So wondering how does health and education operate to impact cognitive functioning, and perhaps how do they interact? We use something called a health problems checklist. It's 16 items that ask things like, do you have hypertension? Have you had a stroke? All cardiovascular related kinds of questions. And then we had another set of cognitive measures we used. The MMSE is a cognitive impairment measure. The CBLT, the California Verbal Learning Test, which has about 6 different little components to it. I'm going to just summarize and just call it one, but it's really to measure how well someone can learn. So before we've been talking about memory and speed of processing, and this is more about, this one anyway, is about learning. There's also the Rabi's progressive matrices, working memory, through the spatial one, and another working memory measure. So the summary of findings found that when we looked at cardiovascular health, the CBLT and the MMSE, the cognitive impairment and the learning measure, were actually related to cardiovascular health when just looking at health. And when you looked at education, all of those measures were actually related to education, just like one would assume. But then the next question was, is that, well, so maybe health and education actually interact to influence cognitive function. And that was true for the MMSE and for the CBLT and for both of the measures, or 2 of the measures of working memory, the digit span forward and the digit span backwards. Those 2 measures, just to give you a little background, are I say 5, 6, 7, 8, and say, give me those numbers backwards. Give me those numbers backwards.
It's too long.
Yes. I stumped her. She's cognitively Asian. But the longer the strings go, the harder it gets, and so the more successful you are, the really long ones, you're supposed to be doing better cognitively. That's the example. So we've answered the first question. does health impact differences? And it seems to. And I've given you several lines of evidence that suggests that health actually accounts for individual differences as well. But the piece, as a good gerontologist, I keep changing all the hats I am. I do genetics, I do cognition, cognitive aging, but I'm a gerontologist, I'm a developmentalist. And the question I always come back to is that this is nice because we're looking at a snapshot. We're looking at it at one point in time. But does this actually hold if you look at someone across time? And so, using some of the data from the Baltimore Study of Successful Aging, we took a look and saw if health indices were predictors of cognitive functioning over time. And I didn't tell you much about why it's called the Study of Successful Agers. Just as we started off talking about that people think that, you get old and you just fall apart. But don't you love those commercials now where the old people are talking on the phone and they're like, and she said, and she this lady's like 80 and they're skateboarding and things. And I think it's meant real satirically, but you are finding that that older group is more active, at least, than they used to be. And that there's plenty of people who are aging successfully. That's not a misnomer to say that you can age well. You can age well. And this particular study went and across 3 huge studies and came up with like 4,300 people and said, wow, all of these people are doing well, but let's take the top third and say you guys are successful agers in terms of how well you're functioning physically, how well your mind's working. You guys are successful agers. And that's what makes up that particular study. There are 243 African Americans in it, and we focused actually specifically on those in this particular paper. Went back to the Boston naming test that I described before and took our health measures and activity measures, grip strength, speed and walking, foot tapping, and said, across time, do those factors actually influence what happens in terms of from one time point to another? These interviews were 2 years apart. Does it influence the trajectory that people are on? If you look at the age of these folks, 2 years is a long time. 70 to 72, it's like, wow, you're really getting older. Okay? So there was plenty of change that happened. And what we found is that the measure of peak expiratory flow and education were risk factors for decline. So that if your peak expiratory flow was going down, your cognitive functioning was going down. And the same thing in terms of if your education was lower, you were at greater risk for declining over that 2-year period of time. And the more important part, I think, is that in terms of self-rated health, of how well am I doing, I'd give myself a 4, give myself a 5. That actually is accounted for the maintenance of cognitive function. So those who actually didn't change over time, they're aging successfully. That was the factor that seemed to be most important, is how well they thought they were actually doing. So, we come back to our questions again. And that, I don't have it on here, but is there variability over time, and does health account for it? Yes, it does. I'm not done with that question. I feel like we haven't got enough information on it. I feel like we're just barely getting to it. And our last study here that we're currently involved in, which is called Patterns of Cognitive Aging, and arguably is one of the larger studies of cognitive functioning with a lot of cognitive variables in it. We're looking at folks over a 3-year period of time and looking to see what may have happened in terms of how well they're functioning. I always like to acknowledge that the National Institute on Aging has been very, very good to me and given me lots of little grants so I can do my work. One of the things that we did was to say, it's going to be interesting to find out what causes people or what accounts for people to change over time. And even more interesting is whether we know whether genetic markers actually account for some of that variability as well. So one of our grants is just specifically even to look at the genetics of, probably you've heard about ApoE. ApoE is a gene that's associated with Alzheimer's disease in a number of cases, and it's mixed in African Americans. It's not sure exactly what's going on, and so we're hoping that our work will actually contribute to that. And what we're doing is we started with wave 1. The folks were 48 to 95 years of age, and there were 602 of them. Their average age was 69. I'm always really excited and scared about that, because when you start collecting African Americans whose life expectancy for men is only about 68, and for women it's only about 72, and you collect them and they're 69, they're not always around for a long time. And I don't have it in this, but I know what was it? I can't tell you what the mortality rate was, but I can tell you that 53 of them have passed away, just within a 3-year period of time. But we're looking at rates of change in cognitive functioning over a 2.5, 3-year period of time. Looking at things like SES and health, exploring if social support actually buffers the loss of cognitive functioning. If we have help from other people, are they actually helping our minds or preserving our minds? Or is the help that we give to other people actually an activity that helps our minds? That's the part that I'm betting on. And then lastly, determining if cognitive functioning and climate performance is related to everyday problem solving. We just finished fairly recently in July with, I didn't put the number up there, it's 450 exactly, which once you take out the people who passed away and the people who moved away, it comes up to about 88% of the people who come back and let us torture them again. I don't know why, but I'm very happy that they did. We got a little bit less in terms of how many men we got back, but the years of education looks like it stayed fairly the same. I know, because I peeked at the data a little bit, we do see that cognitive functioning is going down just by looking at things like cognitive impairment. Even in the folks who are doing well, they're getting older, and so their cognitive performance is going down ever so slightly. So that's the next one. If I can stop traveling, this is the next thing I have to do, is to do some analyses of those and some very interesting structural equation models and things. So try another statistic out, see if I can screw that up. But with that, I think I'll stop and see if we have any questions. Thank you very much for your attention.